Welcome back, Richard. It's good to see you this morning.
Good morning. March,
Yeah.
spring break. The flowers are coming.
Yep, it's almost spring break, and we're going to continue our conversation today. In our last podcast, we talked a little bit about um, disruptive mood dysregulation disorder, and we as we promised, we were going to continue that conversation. And actually, we said a two-parter, but this may end up being a three-parter because there's just a lot to talk about.
Right. Yeah, it's a complicated topic. So we're going to tackle part two today. And the general, you call it disruptive mood dysregulation disorder,
Mhm.
and you slid by it. And for a moment, I thought you said destructive mood dysregulation. He didn't say destructive. He said disruptive.
Disruptive.
But we're going to talk about severe emotional dysregulation. Sort of start with a broad topic.
Mhm.
And as we talked about last week, there's a big difference between temper tantrums and these severe emotional meltdowns that kids have. Tantrums are age appropriate behavior, and they're usually instrumental. And by instrumental, we mean that it's for some gain. A child throws himself on the floor because he wants a cookie instead of dinner. And so to get what he wants, they have a temper tantrum. So because because the temper tantrum might get them what they want. It's age appropriate
Mhm.
until parents ignore it, and then it goes away. Okay, so don't be alarmed when your children have temper tantrums. They're trying out. They're using the arrows in their quiver.
Mhm.
They try different things to get what they want. They can't do that at one, but they have the skills to do it at two. So you're going to see temper tantrums, but it's age appropriate, and it goes away because children learn other ways to get what they want,
Mhm.
other more effective ways to get what they want. But some children don't, and
Right.
it continues beyond that. And now we have a different kind of problem because an emotional meltdown,
Mhm.
these rage attacks and highly aroused states, there's little to no intent. I mean, they're not after anything.
Right.
Rather, they don't, most children who have temper tantrums by age 3, 4, 5, certainly by age 5, develop the ability to manage their emotions.
Mhm.
Children who have these violent emotional meltdowns do not develop the ability to manage their emotions. And that's what we have to work on is it's a problem of not being able to manage your emotions.
Right.
We said last week that there are three forms of severe emotional dysregulation: intermittent explosive disorder, bipolar disorder, and disruptive mood dysregulation disorder.
Right. And when you look at those, there's a few conclusions we can come to, and that is that, certainly these children who respond in these emotionally dysregulated ways, they simply have a difficulty. That's what their problem is, right? Their problem is that they can't regulate their emotions. They are confronted with something, whether sometimes it's just a thought, sometimes it's some limit or restriction that's placed upon them by someone in their environment, or it's just something else going on around them, and they have an emotional reaction that they can't control, and it
Right.
just overflows and takes action. So they all have that part in common, but the real key, the most important thing is that we get the diagnosis correct
Hmm.
because that's going to guide our treatment. That's going to
That's
guide
right.
what we do about it.
Right. So we know there's at least three expressions of this, these kids who never learn how to manage their emotions. And there are these three expressions of it, but we have to make sure we get the right one because there really are very significant differences between these three diagnoses and most importantly, what we do about it.
Right. Absolutely. So one of the ways we like to think about it is there was a paper published long, long ago.
Yeah, back in the
Uh,
70s. Yeah.
six children with fever.
Mm.
And basically what that paper was is it was for pediatricians talking about, you can have six children coming into your practice and they all present with the same symptom, a high fever. But the reason for those fevers may be very different. They could have lots of different reasons why they may have a fever. And so the goal is to search and find the appropriate diagnosis so that you can apply the appropriate treatment. It's the same thing with these emotional meltdowns, this emotional dysregulation. They all kind of look the same.
Right.
You have these
Mhm.
episodic outbursts, you have this loss of emotional control. They're very easily triggered, difficult to calm. But as we talked about last week, even though you have these similar, the topography, the symptom presentation is very similar,
Mhm.
they are all very distinct and different diagnoses because the root cause or the thing that's driving the expression of those symptoms is very different for different kids.
Right, right. And so we want you to keep in mind these three diagnoses that are under this umbrella of severe emotional dysregulation. But before we move on, there's one more differentiation that we want to make that we think is really important. And this is something that parents bring to us on a weekly basis, I mean, on a regular basis. And that is there a difference between disruptive mood dysregulation disorder and oppositional defiant disorder?
Right.
Okay. And this one's a little trickier. We made the differentiations last week with those three. This one's a little trickier.
Mhm.
Um, and it begins with the name because DMDD stands for disruptive mood dysregulation disorder, and oppositional defiance disorder is housed in DSM-4 in the disruptive behavior disorders.
Right.
So you can get thrown by the name, that
Mhm.
that yes, we're talking about disruptive, but one is disruptive mood dysregulation disorder, and oppositional defiant disorder is a disruptive behavior disorder.
And,
So
and
they both are disruptive.
mhm.
By disruptive, they disrupt families
Yeah.
and classrooms. But DMDD is a mood disorder, while oppositional defiant, ODD, is a behavior disorder.
Yeah, and that difference is critical because we have shared our perspective of oppositional defiant disorder many times in the past.
Mhm.
And our primary challenge with that diagnosis is that oppositional defiant disorder, because it's a disruptive behavior disorder,
Mhm.
there's sort of this part of it that it kind of has an implied intent to it.
Mhm.
And that is that kids with oppositional defiant disorder tend to behave in a way such as to be disruptive or to be oppositional or to be defiant with some apparent or what seems to be intent. Um,
Mhm.
you ask them to do something and they just say no.
Mhm.
Or you tell them that they're not allowed to do something, and it's almost as though your introduction of the idea that they shouldn't do it is going to mean that they're going to do it.
Mhm.
And so
Mhm.
you have this oppositionality that is persistent. Sometimes they have anger outbursts, sometimes they argue, sometimes they can be very disobedient, but the behavior feels and is appears to be much more targeted. It's not
Right.
like this generalized, I'm angry and I'm having this emotional meltdown to where the kid loses complete control, like we see in disruptive mood dysregulation disorder. With oppositional defiant disorder, oftentimes it is about that particular person, whether it's the parent or a teacher or another student or something, or usually another adult. And the problems that the child is having is almost specifically directed at that person or a person in that role.
Right. And and you're right. There somebody gets targeted. And I
Hmm.
think it's the intentionality issue that separates this with the mood disorders, whether it's bipolar, intermittent, disruptive mood. Those are all loss of emotional control.
Hmm.
ODD, you have emotional control, you have intentionality, and you do intend to do something. Okay, to be defiant, to be destructive, to hurt somebody. Okay, and usually it's targeted. We target those children target authority figures, but they can also target siblings,
Sure.
and parents always fear that. But there is this intentionality involved, and it separates it. The other thing about ODD is that it typically first presents around age 7 or 8,
Hmm.
whereas these mood disorders generally appear much earlier. They can be
Right.
present at 2 or 3,
Right.
or certainly by 4 or 5. And if a temper tantrum isn't gone by 5, then we have to start trying to figure out why isn't it? Maybe it's not just age appropriate temper tantrum, something else. But so the ODD usually presents a little bit later.
Right.
Um,
And I
right.
think that the other thing that we often hear about ODD, and to some extent it's we'll just say it's big brother conduct disorder.
Mhm.
Um, what we tend to see in kids with those conditions, or kids who have been diagnosed with oppositional defiant disorder or conduct disorder, is that there's almost I don't want to say predatory, but it's
Mhm.
like they are going to get that person. They if they
Right.
feel like that person did them wrong,
Mhm.
a child with DMDD, for example, we I don't remember if we shared this example last time, but I'm thinking back to this child that we saw many, 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 many years ago, and we're finishing up the session, and
Oh.
we see him whispering to dad, and dad kind of shakes his head no and pats him on the leg, and he leans over and he whispers to dad again, and dad shakes his head no and pats him on the leg, and you can see this emotion start to rise in this kid to the point that he jumps up and he slams the door open and slams the door closed, and he goes outside, and you and I are both sitting there, and we're like, just wait, he's
He'll
going to
come
realize
back.
that we're not following him, and he's going to. We were so naive. And so we wait for a few minutes and he doesn't come back in. It's like, okay, let's go see what's going on. And we walk
Mhm.
outside, and this kid, luckily it was a Saturday morning and there was no other cars in the parking lot,
Mhm.
but he is in the parking lot trying to rip shrubs out of the ground, and he is yelling, and he is just without an audience, having this emotional meltdown that was impressive.
Right.
He was angry because dad said that they couldn't stop on the way home and buy
Right.
a Pokemon game. Now,
Mhm.
now, the important thing with this, and the reason I mentioned that example is because once he started having his meltdown, it was generalized. It was he was taking it out on shrubs. He kicked somebody's car. I don't know whose car that was. It wasn't my
He
car.
kicked the door too. We thought he was going to break the glass in the door. Yeah.
Yeah. And
Mhm.
but he was and he didn't matter to him who was around. It didn't
No.
matter if somebody was watching or not. It didn't matter. He was he was in full on rage.
Right.
Now,
Mhm.
that is disruptive mood dysregulation disorder.
Mhm.
If it was opposition, if this was a kid who had oppositional defiant disorder, his target would have been dad, because
That's right.
dad was the one
Mhm.
that said no. And
Mhm.
so he would have just primarily gone after dad. He probably would have started out by, well, if dad's going to say no, I'm going to go ask mom.
Mhm.
Would have tried mom, and if mom said no, again, the target would have been mom and dad, and
Right.
they seem much more calculated, much
Mhm.
more intent. Again, we go back to the word intentional, and
Right.
it's more specific to the people that they feel did them wrong, and that's why even the diagnostic criteria includes some vindictiveness to
Mhm.
it, because they're going to go after the person that they feel did them wrong.
Right.
Very specific.
Right. And with this boy, if there had been somebody out there, didn't he pick up a stick and hit the windshield of their car?
Yeah.
Now, when he picked up that stick and swung it, if there had been somebody around, he would have hit them, not hit them purposely. They may have been hit accidentally.
Right.
Okay. So ODD assumes intention. I want to hurt you even when I'm not angry.
Right.
Okay. And
Because you hurt me.
that's a huge and key difference is that I'm not angry, but I'm going to come after you. That's sort of criminal kind of thinking, okay? And you said a minute ago, kids with ODD, if they continue to have these issues, it changes into conduct disorder when they start breaking laws.
Right.
And that's what we worry about is that these kids are the ones who steal and lie and go out, they're more predatory.
Right.
Whereas kids with mood dysregulation, theirs is involuntary. I might hurt you, but I didn't mean to.
Right.
And frequently they'll apologize. Oh, I'm so sorry I did that.
Hmm.
Kids with ODD don't apologize.
Right.
They intend. So with that in mind, those important distinctions in mind, let's return a minute to DMDD
Hmm.
because this is a very what you just described with that boy who left the office that morning.
Hmm.
These are impressive outbursts. I mean, I like the way you put it. You you disclosed that that we were naive because
Yeah.
he was one of the first kids we saw who had this. In fact, it wasn't even called this in
Right.
the years, right?
Right.
And so these emotional meltdowns, parents, they're very alarming because they are disruptive and they are very, very significant. But they're not a medical condition. It is a stress response. And we want to keep repeating that. We want you to keep hearing that.
Right.
These emotional meltdowns, as significant and frightening as they are for the entire family, it's not a medical problem. It's not a medical condition. It is a stress response.
Right.
Okay. And so the first question we have to ask is, okay, and this is what parents ask, why is this happening? Where is this coming from?
Right.
Okay.
Absolutely.
And
And
there are two sources.
right. And the first is anger.
Right.
And that may seem like a no-brainer, but
Mhm.
one of the things that is really challenging, I think, for some parents to appreciate is that these kids are responding to something, whether it's through anger and the other one just as a heads up. The other one is anxiety.
Right.
Um, the kids are responding with either anxiety or anger sometimes to things that other people don't recognize. Like we may
Mhm.
not even see that there was something going on that they're responding to,
Mhm.
but they see it, or more specifically, their brain perceives it. And because their brain perceives it, they react to it, they respond to it. And so the child may respond, we'll start with anger, may respond with this anger, this sense of injustice, this sense of someone is deliberately, intentionally, willfully trying to harm me or deny me something that I feel like I need. Um, and they're doing it because they want to make me like they're wanting to hurt me.
Mhm.
You know?
Mhm.
And when some of these kids are calm and you talk to them about it, they say it that way. They say, well, they just hate me.
Mhm. Mhm.
We can ask, your parents hate you? What do you
Mhm.
mean your parents hate you? They hate me. Every time I ask them for something, and they'll use words like every time, or they'll say they never do this or that. They
Right.
always do this or that. And again, from their perspective, they're always done wrong. Things never work out in their favor, and
Mhm.
so they respond with this anger response that is usually way disproportionately exaggerated from what's really going on because their brain is
Mhm.
telling them, here's another example of how they always are coming out and they're always against you.
That's right. So when they ask for something, whether let's take the kid in the grocery store. He wants some Pop-Tarts, and we don't want to buy Pop-Tarts, but he wants Pop-Tarts.
Mhm.
And if he doesn't get them, from their perspective, it's my mother is deliberately trying to
Right.
deny me this,
Right.
that I deserve to have Pop-Tarts. I need Pop-Tarts. I
Well,
need them.
they'll even say like that's like the only thing I've ever wanted. I've wanted that like for years. It can be something, and we've had this example where it's something that maybe was just released last
Mhm.
week. And they will
Right.
say, I have wanted this for like 2 years. It's like, no,
And-
it was just released last week. Yeah, but like I knew that it was coming, and then they knew that I wanted it. And even though they knew that I wanted it, and that's the only thing in the world that I've ever wanted, that's
Right.
I never asked for anything. And
Right.
and they knew that I really wanted it, and they said no. And so I know that they hate me. I know that they
Mhm.
don't care about me, and they and it's
Right.
unreasonable, it's irrational,
It
but
is irrational. That's
where
right.
they are.
It's irrational because what happens is they're in their head, it's like, I need to have this. I deserve it. I've been good. I deserve to have it. And when they deny me, and what happens is they get overwhelmed by their frustration with being blocked, and that it's unfair. And they frequently say that you're not fair. This is not fair. They just feel that they deserve it, they need it, they want it. And you're deliberately trying to hurt me in some way.
Mhm.
And that the parents are deliberately withholding it to make them angry. And
Mhm.
they'll tell you that too,
Yeah.
that she made me angry. She did it on purpose.
Mhm.
And so what you see in these very hyper aroused, highly aroused rage attacks, emotional meltdowns, what you're seeing is they're overwhelmed by the frustration and the sense of injustice that they're feeling at the moment, and they lash out.
Mhm.
The emotions come bubbling out, and they lose control. And
Mhm.
once they lose control, and in our practice, we use something called the normal curve, where you have it
Yeah.
goes from here and then it explodes and then it goes back down. Once they explode, now they've lost all control. So just stop, you can't do anything at that point because they are completely overwhelmed and their brain is now just in free fall. So you just have to kind of back up. So they get angry because they feel that they're being mistreated.
Right.
And you said the other one was anxiety.
Right. And I think that the anxiety piece is something that we have sort of learned over time because it all looks like anger to begin with, right? It all looks like anger, and these kids are having these explosions, and they just looked really ticked off all the time. But as some of the kids that we started out working with, as they've gotten older, we continue to talk with them, and we find out that many of them will say, "No, I was like freaking out. Like I was, they can think back to." Um, I'm thinking about this other kid that we worked with who had all these same behaviors,
Mhm.
and he as an adult, he's functioning much better now. But as an adult, he's able to look back at the irrational beliefs that he had. Like he would freak out when his parents would have ask him to go take a shower, and you're like, come on, man, like it's just a shower, and he would become really angry and oppositional and belligerent and have these meltdowns. And though he never said at the time, what he recalls is that he was terrified that snakes and bugs and stuff were going to come up through the shower
Mhm.
drain, and he was terrified
Right.
about being in there, and that happening and not being able to get out. He felt the same way about the swimming pool. He didn't want to get in the swimming pool because he was afraid. Now, this is not a child with intellectual problems in any way, but he was afraid of sharks in his swimming pool.
Mhm.
Now, again, completely irrational, but these are the thoughts and things that got into his mind, and he couldn't negate those. And so he had these perspectives that just terrified him. And so he reacted in these emotional ways out of anxiety and fear for his safety.
Right. And his parents would sometimes force him to get into the shower.
Yeah.
So you can imagine this kid. He has these irrational, yes, of course they're irrational.
Mhm.
If you didn't have them, you wouldn't have DMDD. Okay.
Right.
So, I mean, so he has these irrational fears. And to force him into the shower when he's thinking stuff's going to come out of the drain. And come on, anybody who has seen Psycho is a little bit reluctant to close the shower curtain, right?
Yeah.
Wasn't it Psycho that
Yeah. Yeah.
okay? And you have to admit, or after you saw Jaws,
Hmm.
swimming in the ocean was a different endeavor altogether. So we do have this, but these kids have it in an exaggerated form. Yes, it's irrational, but for them it's real. And it causes them, if they're pushed into these frightening circumstances, they're going to lose emotional control. And
Right.
that's what you're dealing with.
Yeah.
So the source of this loss of emotional control, this emotional dysregulation, is typically either anger for the injustice or anxiety for their fears.
Hmm.
Now, from there, so that's the first thing that we want parents to understand and teachers to understand is that this is the source of the emotional dysregulation.
Right.
But then it gets triggered.
Right.
And so the next thing you have to do, and we're trying to walk you through this from
Hmm.
what, what you're seeing and why you're seeing it and what causes it, and then what triggers it. Because what you have to know as parents and teachers is you want to make sure that you don't pull any of these triggers.
Right.
So first of all, we have to know what they are.
Right.
What are the triggers? Okay.
And there are a variety of triggers. And
Right.
again, some of those triggers may be things that we see and that the adult recognizes as well.
Hmm.
But there may be things that happen internally. And so, sensory overstimulation, there's just way too much going on, and the brain is flooded with too much stimuli. And so the child, the cup overflows and the kid reacts.
Bernie, have you ever had one of these kids who could do a full day at Disney World?
Right. No,
It's too much.
just too
Okay.
much.
Disney, grocery stores, Walmart, Target. But I think the biggest is one of these big theme parks.
Yeah.
There's so much stimulation. There's so much coming in smells and sounds and the heat and the people and the waiting. There's so much going on that their little brains just get flooded and
Hmm.
they can't filter it all out. They can't sort it all out and they just lose it.
Right.
Okay. So sensory overstimulation. So
Right.
think Disney World.
Right. Another is accumulated stress. Like so, a lot of these kids manage themselves relatively well at school throughout the day, but they're
Mhm.
just taking on all of this stress, and it leads to what is actually another one, which is emotional exhaustion. They
Exactly.
have worked so hard at controlling themselves at school or in different settings, and they have gathered so much stress that by the time they get home,
Mhm.
it just they just can't take anymore. They just cannot hold anymore, and so it just comes out, they just can't control it anymore.
And I'm glad you said that because very frequently we'll hear that these kids are doing okay at school. In fact, we've called schools and they said, "Oh no, he never gives us a problem. We don't know what you're talking about." But over the course of the day, the stress accumulates. It's this and problem with kids and problem with PE and they got pushed in the hallway and they got in trouble with a teacher. That stress accumulates all day until they're just exhausted by the time they get home. And then something happens at home and there's this explosion. Okay. So be very careful about accumulated stress and emotional exhaustion.
Right.
And the
There's
next is
also
physical stressors.
absolutely, and in some ways, this is related to just too much stimuli. But if they're too hot or too cold, certainly blood sugar issues. We always encourage kids to be evaluated, medically to make sure that their blood sugar, their thyroid is going okay. They're physically they're healthy, but there's sometimes again just too much stress coming in, and then leading to another one, they get overwhelmed. They're
Right.
just overwhelmed with so much of whatever.
I say to parents, and I say it with kids with ADHD or kids with emotional mood disorders, they don't handle stimulation the way we do.
Right.
We said earlier they don't learn other skills to manage their emotions, so they have outbursts. These kids are hypersensitive. We always talk about sensory sensitivity.
Mhm.
Um, if it's too hot, if it's too cold, if their blood sugar goes down, they don't manage these physical changes very well. They don't manage many of these kids are sensitive to clothes, the seams and tags and all that, because their bodies just seem to be hypersensitive
Mhm.
to environmental or physical uh, temperatures and feelings, and they don't like textures. And because they are emotionally fragile,
Right.
and they become emotionally reactive. Okay.
Yeah.
But so if you think about it that way, yeah, it makes sense that these kids are very sensitive. They get overwhelmed very quickly.
Yeah.
Now, with children, they have one final problem, and that is they can't explain how they're feeling.
Right.
Emotions build up, and they don't have any way of saying, "I'm having a." What do adults do? I'm having a really bad day today. Don't talk to me about that. Okay,
Right.
kids don't do that. They don't have the language for that.
And oftentimes one of their big complaints is that the adults in their life don't let them
They
do.
don't. Right.
A lot of times these kids will say, I try to walk away and they won't let me walk away. It's like, okay. So we have to work with the parents on some of those kind of things. But yeah, that inability to express themselves, and certainly as they become more emotional, our ability to communicate when we're emotional
Hmm.
is quite limited. And so,
Right.
there's a lot of things working against them in these situations where they want to be able to express themselves, but they just can't.
Right. Now, I know what everybody is thinking right now is, okay, so what should we do about it? Well, like a good old soap opera, that's coming next week.
Right.
Okay. So we wanted to explain the source and what to look for and how to manage things. And next week, and Dr. Berney said earlier, this is probably going to be in two parts. There's so much that we want to talk about with the interventions that it really is going to require another session. So we will talk about that next week. What we wanted to stress this week is that these meltdowns, this emotional dysregulation, whether it's no matter what we call it, these are problems that stem from a child's inability to manage their emotions, their anger, their anxiety, their sense of fairness, their sense of justice. Um, these are these are involuntary. It's an involuntary loss of control. They don't mean to hurt anybody. With oppositional defiant disorder, they do intend to hurt. That's a different issue, and we can help sort that out. But these very impressive meltdowns are a loss of emotional control, and we have to manage that mood. We have to help our children manage the emotions. You said when you were talking about that boy, when he got older, he was fine.
Mhm.
What happens when you get older? The brain matures and you develop the ability to manage your emotions.
Mhm.
So typically, these children who are so incredibly difficult to deal with when they're 8 and 9 and 10 and 12, by the time they're 17 and 18, they're not doing this anymore
Mhm.
because they develop the ability to manage their emotions.
Yeah.
We have to help them with that until they get there.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So yes, next episode we'll talk about what to do about some of these issues because um, that's always the question. That's the big question. So, all right. Well, that's it for today. Until next time, stay happy, stay healthy, and forget to be afraid.